Imagine walking down a crowded beach on a really bright July afternoon.
Right, like a classic summer Sunday.
Exactly, a Sunday. The air is thick with the smell of sunscreen and, barbecue smoke.
People everywhere.
Thousands of people around you. They're drinking beer, sunbathing, listening to radios. And right in the middle of that massive crowd, a handsome young man with his arm in a plaster cast walks up to a young woman and just asks for a simple favor.
Just a totally normal interaction.
Yeah, seemingly normal. They walk toward the parking lot together, and within minutes, she vanishes completely. No one screams. No one notices a struggle. It is as if she simply evaporated into the humid summer air.
And then, incredibly, a few hours later, he comes back to that exact same beach and does it again.
It's just chilling. If you're listening to this deep dive right now, you are probably familiar with the broad strokes of this story.
It's the famous one.
Right. But you're here because you want to bypass the surface level, that Hollywood mythology that usually surrounds true crime. You want to get to the actual forensic realities, the psychological mechanics.
The real nuts and bolts.
Yeah, the specific details of how something this brazen could actually happen.
Well, to understand the mechanics of it, we have to completely remove ourselves from the modern world and transport ourselves back to the Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s.
It was a totally different time.
It really was. We are looking at a society defined by a deeply ingrained, almost naive, trusting culture.
Right.
It was an era where thumbing a ride wasn't viewed as this high-risk gamble with your life. Hitchhiking was just this standard logistical method for young people to get from point A to point B.
It's a communal, open society. People just left their doors unlocked.
Exactly.
And into that exact environment, completely undetected, steps a highly organized predator, a predator who didn't just operate in that trusting culture, but who actively weaponized it.
He used it against them.
He really did. And that collision between a trusting society and a calculating killer is our mission today. We are going to meticulously chronicle the terrifying evolution of Theodore Robert Bundy during the Summer of Slaughter in 1974.
We'll trace his escalation through the attacks on Brenda Carroll Ball, Jorgen Hawkins, Janice Ann Ott, and Denise Marie Naslund.
The 4 major cases from that summer.
Right. We're going to break down his incredibly specific modus operandi, the grueling reality of his remote dump sites, and the systemic institutional blind spots that eventually allowed him to slip right through the fingers of law enforcement and flee to Utah.
But before we go any further, I need to lay down a very clear ground rule for this deep dive.
Yeah, this is important.
It is. The sources we pulled for this contain incredibly graphic, uncensored forensic details.
Very graphic.
We are talking about severe perimortem trauma, that's the violence inflicted at the time of death, and deeply disturbing post-mortem rituals. We are not going to censor or gloss over these details.
No, because understanding the exact nature of this pathology is really the only way to accurately reconstruct the criminology here.
Right. You cannot understand the shadow if you refuse to look at what's casting it.
Well said. The reality of those crime scenes is the truest reflection of how his mind actually functioned. It strips away that charming facade and shows us the sheer mechanical brutality that allowed him to evade capture for so long.
So let's establish a baseline.
Yeah.
Before we get into the blazing sunshine of that horrific summer of '74,
Yeah.
we need to look at the winter.
Right, earlier that year.
Yeah. How did this campaign actually start? Because predators like this rarely just wake up one day and start snatching people off crowded public beaches.
No, they don't. The public daylight attacks were the result of a very carefully refined escalation. The true baseline for his 1974 campaign was established in January with his attack on a young woman named Karen Sparks.
And this was a totally different operational method, wasn't it?
Completely different. It was a nocturnal residential home invasion. He infiltrated her living space while she was sleeping, resulting in a savage beating with a metal rod and a brutal sexual assault.
So he starts out as this clandestine intruder. He's operating strictly in the dark, breaking into a private sanctuary where someone expects to be completely safe.
Exactly.
And then, as we move into the spring of '74, the victim count starts to rise, but the pattern shifts slightly. We see the disappearances of Linda Ann Healy, Donna Gail Manson, and Susan Raincourt.
And reviewing the case files, there is a rigid, almost terrifyingly specific template emerging with these women.
The victimology.
Right. The victimology is incredibly strict. He wasn't targeting a broad demographic at all. He was looking for young, attractive, college-aged women, specifically those with long, dark hair, typically parted right down the middle.
Wow. If an offender is sticking that strictly to a physical type, it really rules out crimes of opportunity, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, he's not just driving around waiting to see a vulnerable person walking alone in an alley.
No, he's hunting a proxy. When you see a physical template that rigid, it indicates a deep pathological compulsion rooted in a distinct aesthetic fixation.
Like he's trying to recreate something.
Precisely. He is trying to gain power and control over a very specific representation of a person, likely tied to an early psychological rejection or a figure from his past. The women were tragically interchangeable to him as long as they fit that exact visual profile.
It's just horrible. But the question that kept jumping out at me in the source material is how he was getting away with this across multiple cities. I mean, he's taking women from Seattle, from Tacoma, from Corvallis down in Oregon.
Spread out all over the place.
Right. Today, if 3 women with the exact same physical description vanished from college towns in the Pacific Northwest within weeks of each other, an algorithm would flag it instantly.
Oh, without a doubt. But you have to picture the analog reality of a police department in 1974.
Typewriters and paper files.
Exactly. There are no centralized digital forensic databases. There is no National Crime Information Center or VICAP system that cross-references behavioral data. You have detectives sitting in smoke-filled rooms, typing reports on carbon paper, and literally filing them away in metal cabinets.
It's like trying to complete a massive jigsaw puzzle, but everyone playing is holding a handful of different pieces, and they're all sitting in separate rooms in separate cities.
That's a great analogy. And to make it worse, they don't even know what the picture on the front of the puzzle box looks like.
Right.
Criminologists refer to this as linkage blindness. Because a detective in Tacoma had no immediate systematic way of knowing what a detective in Seattle was working on, they all treated these disappearances as completely isolated, localized incidents.
Add that systemic blindness to a culture where hitchhiking was so common that young people were frequently unaccounted for anyway, and you have the perfect environment for a predator to thrive.
The perfect storm.
But the shift from winter to summer is what really fascinates me. If he was already highly successful at creeping into homes at night, operating as this phantom nocturnal intruder, why change the game?
That's the big question.
Why step out of the shadows and into broad daylight?
Well, moving into public spaces was driven by his growing pathology, a need for more frequent and perhaps more brazen dominance, but it presented a massive logistical hurdle.
Because breaking into a house is risky.
Incredibly high risk. You don't know the layout, you don't know if a roommate is home, you don't control the environment at all. To hunt in public, he needed a completely new set of tools.
Right.
He needed a meticulously crafted public facade to bypass the victim's natural defenses, and he needed a highly controlled, mobile, soundproof environment to trap them once those defenses were lowered.
Which brings us to the architecture of deception, the modus operandi, the ruse.
The ruse, yes.
He didn't just rely on grabbing someone and overpowering them.
Yeah.
He engineered a psychological theatrical performance.
And this became the absolute hallmark of his 1974 summer campaign. He deployed the injured man ruse. He would appear in semi-public or public spaces projecting an image of physical helplessness.
Just playing on people's sympathies.
Exactly. He would wear a plaster of Paris arm sling or a fake leg cast, and he would hobble around, often dropping items or struggling to carry books or a briefcase.
It is such a cynical calculation. The source material notes he explicitly stated he was targeting the tender-hearted nature of these young women.
He knew exactly what he was doing.
He really did. He realized that a young woman in 1974 would not hesitate to help a clean-cut, struggling man who looked like he was in pain.
No, of course not.
And I really want to push back on the popular media narrative that labels him as some sort of evil genius or a mastermind.
Oh, I agree completely.
He wasn't a mastermind. He essentially reverse-engineered altruism to create a trap. He weaponized human empathy.
That's a crucial distinction right there. It wasn't genius, it was just an apex level of predatory manipulation. He hijacked the fundamental sociological programming that tells us to assist the vulnerable.
Right.
And that manipulation was supercharged by his physical presentation. The case files consistently reference his law school demeanor.
He looked the part.
He was an upstanding, clean-cut, well-spoken, white, college-educated man.
Which made him essentially invisible to the police.
Completely invisible. Think about the suspect profile of the era. Society, and by extension law enforcement, expected a violent serial offender to look like a monster.
Like the boogeyman.
Right. They were looking for a transient, a social misfit, someone who looked visibly deranged or unhinged. Because his presentation was the polar opposite of that expected profile, he used society's own biases as a shield.
So even if someone thought his behavior was slightly odd, his appearance instantly short-circuited their suspicion. So he has the psychological trap set. But the physical mechanism that made this entirely possible, the thing that turned his public hunting into a viable strategy, was his car.
The Volkswagen.
Yeah, the 1968 tan Volkswagen Beetle. Let's really look at the tactical modifications he made to this vehicle, because this is where the sheer mechanical coldness of his operation becomes clear.
The most significant and terrifying modification was the front passenger seat.
What did he do to it?
He mechanically unbolted it and completely removed it from the front of the cabin.
Wow.
He would either place it in the back seat area or store it entirely out of the way.
On the surface, if a police officer pulls him over for a broken taillight, a missing passenger seat just looks like a quirky characteristic of a beat-up college car.
A poor student's car.
Right. But the utility of that missing seat is brilliant in the darkest way possible.
It really is. By removing that seat, he created a large, empty void right on the floorboard of the vehicle. When he lured a victim to the car and subsequently incapacitated them, he could shove them down into that void and lay them completely flat.
So they were entirely below the window line.
Completely.
So if you're a pedestrian walking by or even a police cruiser stopped next to him at a red light, you glance over at this tan VW Bug, and all you see is a handsome guy driving alone.
The windows offer no angle to view the floorboard. It is perfect mobile concealment.
It's terrifying. It transformed a standard mode of transportation into a highly efficient tactical space.
Allowing him to transit from crowded public areas to his remote secondary dump sites without raising a single red flag.
And to understand how he was incapacitating them to get them into that void, we have to look at what authorities eventually found inside his car when he was arrested in Utah in 1975.
The murder kit.
Right. They found what investigators referred to as a murder kit. And the items in this kit are directly indicative of how he operated during the summer of '74.
Let's break down the forensic application of those items. The kit contained a heavy crowbar, an ice pick, handcuffs, a flashlight, thick gloves, torn strips of sheeting, a knit ski mask, a mask fashioned from pantyhose, and plastic garbage bags.
Let's start with the crowbar. Why a crowbar and not a firearm? A lot of people wonder why he didn't just use a gun to force them into the car.
Well, a firearm introduces noise, and noise destroys the controlled environment.
That makes sense.
The crowbar, or metal pipe, served as the primary instrument for instantaneous, silent, blunt force trauma. When a victim leaned into the car to place the books or help with the non-existent item, he would strike them from behind.
So it's over before it begins.
Yes. It instantly disables the central nervous system before they can scream, fight back, or alert anyone nearby.
It's all about speed and silence. And then the restraints. The handcuffs are obvious, but the torn strips of sheeting are interesting.
Torn sheeting is highly pliable. It can be easily concealed in a pocket. It doesn't leave the distinct mechanical bruising that metal handcuffs or coarse rope might leave. And it allows for rapid, secure immobilization of the victim's limbs once they are in the floorboard void.
Wow. And the plastic garbage bags.
Forensic shielding. Blunt force trauma to the head produces significant blood spatter. The bags were likely utilized to contain the bleeding within the vehicle, preventing biological evidence from soaking into the upholstery, and later facilitating the disposal of evidence.
Then you have the ice pick and the flashlight. Those aren't necessarily for the abduction itself, are they?
No, those are tactical utilities for the secondary phase of the crime. The flashlight was essential for navigating his remote, densely wooded dump sites in the pitch black.
And the ice pick.
The ice pick is a devastatingly quiet, close-quarters weapon, but it also functions as a tool for deflating tires if he needed to disable a victim's vehicle, or for manipulating materials at the burial sites. Every single item had a specific practiced purpose.
So, with this mobile trap perfected, the missing seat, the murder kit, the rehearsed injured man routine, we move to the first major attack of the summer campaign.
The test run.
Exactly. This is where he tests this entire strategy out in the real world. June 1st, 1974, the abduction of Brenda Carroll Ball.
Chronologically, we are looking at the bridge between his earlier nocturnal attacks and his later daylight operations.
Okay.
Brenda Carroll Ball was 22 years old, a former student at Highline Community College. Let's reconstruct the timeline of the evening of May 31st, leading into the early morning hours of June 1st.
She was at the Flame Tavern, right?
Yes. Brenda had visited the Flame Tavern in Bury in Washington. She was there by herself.
And her friends knew she was intending to get a ride over to Sun Lakes, which is on the eastern side of the state, to meet up with them. So she's at the tavern, she's having a few drinks, and she stays until closing time, which hits around 2 a.m.
Right, late at night.
And witnesses inside the tavern actually noted that she was actively trying to secure a ride. She asked one of the musicians playing that night for a lift, but he was heading in the opposite direction.
And that detail is crucial because it highlights her vulnerability at that exact moment. She was actively seeking transportation.
A perfect target.
The last confirmed sighting of Brenda places her in the tavern parking lot shortly after 2 a.m., and witnesses observed her having a conversation with a handsome young man who had his arm resting in a sling.
There it is. The first deployed instance of the ruse that we have documented.
It's a textbook application of his new methodology. He likely observed her inside the tavern, recognized that she was alone and soliciting a ride, and intercepted her in the parking lot.
Under the guise of needing help.
Exactly. He uses the feigned injury to ask for her assistance, perhaps to carry something to his vehicle, the tan Volkswagen.
And once she's at the car, the trap springs.
The forensic evidence recovered much later indicates he would have struck her with the crowbar, achieving that instant incapacitation before loading her into the void where the passenger seat used to be.
Right in the parking lot.
The parking lot at 2 a.m. provided just enough darkness and isolation to execute the strike without drawing attention.
Now, what is incredibly frustrating and honestly devastating about Brenda's case is what happened in the aftermath. The timeline of the investigation is agonizing.
It really is.
She wasn't officially reported missing to the police until June 19th. That is a 19-day delay.
Almost 3 weeks.
If you're listening to this, you know the first 48 hours of a missing persons case are the most critical. Why on earth did it take almost 3 weeks for the alarm bells to ring?
This brings us back to the sociological landscape of the 1970s. Brenda was frequently described by her peers and subsequently by the media as a free spirit.
Ah, I see.
In that era, young people dropping off the grid for a few weeks to hitchhike, camp, or travel without checking in wasn't entirely abnormal. Her friends assumed she had just made it to Sun Lakes or decided to travel elsewhere.
But the consequence of that societal labeling, calling her a free spirit, was catastrophic from an investigative standpoint.
It was fatal to the investigation. By dismissing her absence as typical behavior, it granted the offender an immense 19-day head start.
19 days of wind, rain, and people forgetting.
Exactly. The transient physical evidence in the tavern parking lot, tire tracks, blood droplets, dropped items, was long gone. Eyewitness memories faded.
Meaning the trail wasn't just cold, it essentially never existed in the first place.
Precisely. Furthermore, and perhaps more disturbingly, it allowed the offender a prolonged, uninterrupted period to interact with her remains at his secondary remote site.
Oh.
He had zero fear of search parties or police helicopters because nobody was looking for her.
If we look at the setting of this attack, striking in a tavern parking lot at 2 a.m., it feels like he's testing the waters. He's not breaking into a bedroom in the dead of night anymore, which is what he did in the winter.
Right.
But he's also not quite operating the bright sunshine yet.
It was a proof of concept. He tested the injured man persona in a semi-public but still dark and relatively isolated environment. And the crucial takeaway for him was the result. Silence.
Total silence.
Because of the 19-day delay in the missing persons report, he received absolutely no negative feedback. There was no police heat, no media frenzy, no composite sketches on the evening news.
The success of the Flame Tavern abduction emboldened him in a massive way, and the tragic end to Brenda's story wouldn't be known for nearly a year.
A long time to wait.
Her remains weren't discovered until March 1st, 1975, when forestry students from a local community college stumbled upon a skull on Taylor Mountain, which is about 30 miles east of where she was taken.
And the forensic analysis of that skull showed severe perimortem blunt force trauma, a massive fracture completely consistent with a heavy metal rod.
Confirming the operational utility of the murder kit.
Exactly. But as you noted, the lack of immediate consequences acted as a psychological accelerant. He realized the system was too slow to catch him. Just 10 days later, he would strike again.
10 days.
And this time, he wouldn't rely on the cover of a late-night tavern parking lot. He would target a highly populated, bustling area, effectively turning the volume up on his own risk.
Which brings us to June 11th, 1974, the surgical strike on Jorgen Hawkins.
Jorgen Hawkins was an 18-year-old student at the University of Washington in Seattle. She was a member of a sorority, deeply integrated into campus life.
She was walking home, wasn't she?
Yes. On the night of June 10th, stretching into the early hours of June 11th, she was simply walking from a male friend's residence back to her own sorority house.
Now, if you've ever been to a major university, you know what Greek Row is like. It is not some isolated, desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere.
Far from it.
It is the absolute center of student activity. The route she was taking was a short, well-lit alleyway that runs directly behind the fraternities and sororities. It's an area constantly trafficked by students, even late at night.
Which makes the mechanics of what happened next all the more terrifying. The offender had been, in his own words later, canvassing the area.
Actively hunting.
He was actively hunting, driving the modified Volkswagen through the campus streets, looking for the right target to isolate. He intercepted Jorgen right in that alleyway.
Using the ruse again.
Yes. In his extensive confessions in 1989, he detailed the exact mechanics of this abduction. He approached her in the alley, utilized the injured ruse, likely struggling with crutches or dropping a briefcase he couldn't manage with his sling, and introduced himself using the name Ted.
Using his real name.
He lured her a short distance toward his parked vehicle under the guise of needing assistance.
If you're sitting there wondering how on earth nobody heard her scream in a crowded alleyway, this is where the speed and the surgical precision of his methodology becomes chilling.
It was instantaneous.
She vanished in a matter of seconds. There were students in the houses flanking that exact alleyway. Windows were open because it was a warm summer night.
People were right there.
Students were studying, talking, listening to music. And yet, not a single person heard a scream. Not a single person heard a struggle.
This highlights a concept we call the forensic void. When we discussed his earlier winter crimes, the home invasions, there were physical indicators left behind, signs of forced entry, a disrupted environment, biological evidence.
But here,
in the Hawkins case, there was an absolute void. No personal items were dropped in a panic. No blood was left on the pavement.
is the terrifying contrast that strikes me. You have a bustling college campus on one hand, and a complete total absence of physical reality on the other. It's a magic trick performed with a human life.
It really was.
How long did it take investigators to even get a lead on this? Because unlike Brenda Ball, Jorgen was missed immediately. Her sorority sisters knew she was gone the next morning.
And yet for months, the Hawkins case remained an absolute mystery. Even with immediate police response, without a crime scene to process, investigators had nowhere to start.
Nowhere at all.
The speed of the attack was his primary weapon. He struck her instantly, likely with the crowbar, disabling her before her vocal cords could even register a scream, and immediately shoved her into the concealment of the modified VW bug.
So she was just gone.
She was on the floorboard and out of sight before any alarm could possibly be raised.
According to his confessions years later, he immediately drove her off campus to a secluded, wooded area where he raped and murdered her.
And the source material notes that the forensic landscape for Jorgen is particularly grim, even compared to the others.
It is deeply tragic.
The offender claimed that partial skeletal remains belonging to Jorgen were eventually recovered on September 6, 1974, at one of his primary dump sites.
But they couldn't be totally sure, right?
Exactly. Due to the high degree of animal scavenging and severe decomposition over the summer months, making a specific, definitive identification of the postcranial remains, the bones below the skull, was incredibly difficult.
The elements erased her.
The natural elements essentially acted as an accomplice, destroying the physical evidence of his crimes.
So we've gone from a 2 a.m. tavern parking lot to a busy college alleyway. The escalation in his confidence is just staggering.
He's getting bolder every time.
He's proving to himself that his trap works anywhere.
Oh.
But we are now moving to the absolute peak of the offender's brazenness. We're leaving the cover of darkness entirely.
Broad daylight.
We are moving to a crowded public beach on a bright summer day. This is the day that would fundamentally change Washington state forever.
We're talking about July 14th, 1974, the Lake Sammamish double abduction.
Double.
This represents the most high-risk, arrogant, and chaotic phase of his entire campaign.
Let's paint the picture for the listeners.
Yeah.
It is a hot Sunday in July. Lake Sammamish State Park is absolutely packed.
Wall-to-wall people.
It's the day of the annual Rainier Beer Picnic, which is a huge local event. There are thousands of attendees on the beach, splashing in the water, grilling food, milling around the parking lots.
Very chaotic.
It is loud, it is crowded, it is the absolute last place you would expect a violent predator to be actively hunting.
And yet, within a span of approximately 4 hours, he successfully abducted 2 young women from the middle of that massive crowd.
It's unbelievable.
The sheer psychological arrogance required to execute this, to believe you are so invisible that you can take 2 people from a crowd of thousands, is almost incomprehensible.
Let's look at the first victim of the day, Janice Ann Ott.
Janice was a 23-year-old caseworker. She was known for being incredibly responsible and kind.
And she rode her yellow bicycle to the park that day, and she even left a note for her roommate saying she was going sunbathing.
Just a normal Sunday.
So she's lying on the crowded beach, enjoying the afternoon, when she is approached by a handsome man dressed in tennis whites, white shorts, white shirt, and of course his arm is in a plaster sling.
Because he was performing this ruse in front of dozens of people, we actually have incredibly specific witness testimony for this encounter.
People were right there.
Witnesses lying on towels just a few feet away overheard the man ask Janice for help. He claimed he needed assistance lifting a sailboat onto the roof of his car, and he explicitly told her that the boat was located at his parents' house in Issaquah, which was a short drive away.
The audacity of that lie is stunning. He's not just trying to lure her to his car in the parking lot. He's actively trying to lure her away from the park entirely, under the guise of driving to a secondary location to do a favor for an injured man.
And Janice, being cautious but polite, actually expresses concern about leaving her yellow bike unattended on the beach.
Because she's responsible.
Right. But he has an answer prepped for every objection. He smoothly assures her that there is plenty of room for the bicycle in the trunk of his car. And then a witness overhears the chilling introduction that would eventually become the key to unraveling his entire identity. Janice says, "Hi, I'm Jan," and the man replies, "I'm Ted."
They walk away together toward the parking lot, and Janice Ann Ott is never seen alive again. He executes the abduction in the parking lot, forces her into the void of the Volkswagen, drives to his remote dump site, commits the murder, and then, inexplicably, he returns to the exact same crowded park.
Which is a level of psychological compartmentalization that defies logic.
How does he even do that?
At approximately 4:30 p.m., while friends of Janice Ott haven't even realized she's officially missing yet, 19-year-old Denise Marie Naslund vanishes from the exact same beach.
The timeline overlap is staggering. Think about that. While one victim's family is just hours away from the worst news of their lives, he has already reset his trap and is back hunting the next.
Unbelievable.
Denise was at the park with her boyfriend and another couple. They were having a picnic. She simply left the group to use the restroom, leaving her sandals behind on the beach blanket.
While there were no direct witnesses who saw Denise interact with the man in the sling, her mother later stated that Denise's helpful, intensely kind nature made her the ideal target for this specific ruse.
The tender-hearted nature again.
Exactly. The starkest indicator that something was terribly wrong, the thing that panicked her friends, was that Denise's dog, who had accompanied her toward the restroom facilities, eventually found its way back to her friends alone, dragging its leash.
Now, between these two successful abductions, there is a detail in the source material that is absolutely vital to understanding how his mind worked under pressure. It's the near miss.
Yes. There was another woman approached by Ted that day at the park.
And this encounter gives us a rare, critical glimpse into his behavioral flexibility.
He approached another woman, estimated to be in her early 20s, using the exact same sailboat ruse. And initially, it worked. She agreed to help him.
She actually went with him.
She walked with him out of the crowded beach area and into the parking lot toward his vehicle.
And witnesses describe the vehicle she walked toward as a metallic brown or light tan Volkswagen Bug. But when they get to the car, the woman's situational awareness kicks in.
Or gut feeling.
Yeah, she looks at the car, looks around, and realizes something is profoundly wrong. There is no sailboat on the roof of the car. There is no boat anywhere in the vicinity.
This is the moment where a lesser criminal would panic. If a victim catches you in the lie before you have physical control of them, the natural instinct is flight.
Run away.
But he doesn't panic.
Yeah.
He smoothly adapts. We see the pivot tactic. When his initial lie is directly challenged, he immediately pivots the story, claiming, "Oh, the boat is actually up at my folks' house just to jump up the hill."
Trying to smooth it over.
He tries to seamlessly transition the lie to maintain control of the interaction and get her into the car.
But thankfully, the woman's intuition was screaming at her. She declines. She tells him she is waiting for her husband, which is a classic de-escalation tactic, and she quickly walks away.
It's terrifying to think how close she came to ending up in that missing passenger seat void.
It really is. But that near miss, combined with the incredibly public abductions of Janice and Denise, generated an unprecedented amount of witness observation.
It broke the case wide open.
For the first time, law enforcement wasn't completely blind. We now had a suspect identity. He introduced himself as Ted. We had a detailed physical description. Handsome, wavy hair, white shirt, tennis shorts, arm in a sling.
A very clear picture.
We had a vehicle description, a metallic brown VW Beetle. And we had the specific behavioral ruse, asking for help loading a sailboat. All of this was corroborated by tourist photos and reindeer beer picnic film that police confiscated from attendees that day.
So they finally had a solid lead.
So we know exactly how we got them into the car, we know the mechanics of the trap, but I have to ask, what happens after? Once they're in the vehicle, once they are incapacitated and concealed in that floorboard void, where is he taking them?
To answer that, we must leave the bright, public sunshine of Lake Sammamish and look at the remote, secluded environments where the absolute darkest elements of his pathology unfolded. We need to examine the killing fields.
The source material contrasts two primary recovery sites used during this era. Issaquah, which is directly tied to the July 14th double abduction, and Taylor Mountain, which was the repository for his earlier summer and spring victims. Let's start with Issaquah.
The remains of Janice Ott and Denise Noslin were discovered in September of 1974, roughly 2 months after they vanished, by men hunting for grouse.
Way out in the woods.
The site was a highly remote, heavily wooded area situated along a secluded service road about 2 miles east of Lake Sammamish State Park. This dense isolation provided the precise seclusion the offender required for what came after the murders.
The forensic reports from Issaquah are brutal. The remains were described as severely putrefied, which means they had undergone the late stages of decomposition, having been exposed to the high summer heat and significant animal scavenging for over 60 days.
And the condition of the remains tells a story of extreme, localized violence.
Which matches the murder kit.
Both victims exhibited massive skull fractures. This perimortem trauma, the injury that caused their deaths, is entirely consistent with being struck forcefully by the crowbar or metal pipe from his murder kit.
It's awful.
Based on the angle of the fractures, investigators theorize he likely struck them as they were leaning into the vehicle to look for the non-existent sailboat or immediately upon arriving at the Issaquah site.
But the horror of Issaquah doesn't stop with the physical trauma of the murders themselves. There is a deeply disturbing administrative failure attached to these specific remains.
Oh, this part is incredibly hard to read.
I read this in the notes and had to reread it to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. The King County Medical Examiner's Office was later hit with a $2 million lawsuit by the families of Janice and Denise.
Yes.
Why? Because in 1976, during an office relocation, the Medical Examiner's Office literally lost or accidentally cremated the remains of these two women.
It is a profound, almost unbelievable institutional failure.
How does that even happen?
The families were already enduring unimaginable, agonizing grief, and they were subsequently denied the basic human right to properly inter their daughter's remains. It compounded the trauma exponentially, adding an administrative betrayal on top of a horrific crime.
It's inexcusable.
Yeah.
Let's contrast the Issaquah site with the Taylor Mountain site. Taylor Mountain wasn't found until March of 1975 by the explorers' search and rescue personnel.
Right.
And as I'm looking at the evidence logs, this wasn't just a dump site where someone quickly disposed of evidence and fled. This was a massive, complex killing field.
The scale of Taylor Mountain is horrifying. Investigators logged 158 distinct evidence finds at this location.
158.
This is the site where authorities eventually recovered the remains of Brenda Ball, Linda Ann Healy, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, and at least one unidentified victim. The sheer volume and spatial distribution of the forensic artifacts paint a picture of a site that was used long-term and repeatedly by the offender.
Walk me through those 158 pieces of evidence. What exactly were they finding scattered across this mountain?
Well, they found fragmented skeletal remains, heavily dispersed. They found skulls and mandibles alongside postcranial elements that showed extensive, heavy animal damage from coyotes and bears.
Awful.
They found scraps of women's clothing that matched the last known outfits of the missing girls. They found snug ties, which are improvised ligatures indicative of bondage and physical restraint.
Like the torn sheeting.
Exactly. They found empty chemical bottles, suggesting he was using caustic substances to manage decomposition or clean the area. And deeply unsettling, mixed in with all of this, they found fast food wrappers and empty soup cans.
Okay, let's pause right there.
Yeah.
The soup cans.
Yeah.
I had a profound visceral reaction reading that detail in the source notes.
It's a detail that really stays with you.
It is one thing to commit a horrific act of violence in a fit of rage or compulsion. It is an entirely different, almost unfathomable level of psychological dissociation to commit a brutal murder and then calmly sit down in the dirt, pull out a can opener, and eat a can of soup next to decomposing human remains.
That specific detail, the soup cans, is the clearest window we have into the depths of his pathology. For a normal human being, a site with decomposing bodies is a place of primal terror, disgust, and overwhelming guilt.
You'd want to run as far away as possible.
Exactly. For the offender, the dump site was a sanctuary. The graphic forensic reports from Taylor Mountain noted overturned earth and artificial depressions in the ground, indicating rudimentary burials and even the presence of a makeshift lean-to structure.
Wait, he built a structure?
He built a shelter there. He was spending prolonged, relaxed periods of time at this site, completely comfortable in an environment that would biologically repulse anyone else.
Why? What is the psychological drive behind returning to a place like that? Building a shelter, eating meals, spending hours in the dark surrounded by what he had done?
In his 1989 death row confessions, the offender attempted to articulate this by describing a psychological state he referred to as the entity.
The entity.
This was a dark, consuming compulsion that went far beyond the physical act of murder itself. The murder wasn't the end of the event, it was merely the preamble to a prolonged period of total, unadulterated domination.
And this brings us to the uncensored details of his post-mortem rituals. The source material outlines behaviors that are incredibly difficult to hear, but absolutely essential for understanding the severe necrophilic disorder driving this entire campaign.
Yes. The core of true necrophilia isn't just a sexual attraction to the dead, it's a desire for absolute power. The victim, in his mind, transitioned from a living threat into a prize to be kept, manipulated, and controlled.
It's just sick.
He confessed to grooming the dead, spending hours washing the hair of his victims and meticulously applying makeup to their faces long after they had been murdered.
Oh my God.
He confessed to decapitation, admitting that on at least one occasion, he severed the heads of his victims and kept them in his apartment as temporary trophies before eventually disposing of them when decomposition made it impossible to keep them.
And the repeated sexual assaults at the sites?
He would return to the Taylor Mountain and Issaquah sites repeatedly over the course of weeks to perform sexual acts on the decomposing corpses. This is the apex of the pathology. He desired a partner who possessed absolutely no autonomy, who could not reject him, who could not judge him, fight back, or leave.
Right.
By interacting with the dead, he achieved the ultimate possession. And he only stopped visiting these sites, he only ceased interacting with the remains when, in his own clinical words, destruction by wild animals made further interactions impossible.
It is absolute total depravity. His internal life had fractured into extreme, chaotic pathology. He is essentially living a severe double life. He is the charming, articulate law student by day, shaking hands with politicians, and the monster of Taylor Mountain by night.
Two completely different people.
But even as his internal life spiraled into darkness, his external intellect, the cold, calculating part of his brain, realized that his brazen daytime operations at Lake Sammamish had fundamentally exposed him. The clock was ticking.
Exactly. The public nature of the July 14th double abduction was a massive tactical error driven by hubris. He flew too close to the sun.
Yep.
The net was closing rapidly, and his analytical mind recognized that he needed to execute an immediate tactical retreat from the Pacific Northwest.
So let's look at the specific factors that forced his departure from Washington by late August of 1974. The Lake Sammamish witnesses had provided authorities with enough information to generate a composite sketch.
And while police sketches are rarely photorealistic, this one bore a striking, undeniable resemblance to him.
It really did. And more incredibly, they had published the name Ted.
Using his real first name was an unprecedented lapse in operational security for someone who had been so meticulous about the missing seat and the murder kit.
Right. And because of that sketch, and the name Ted being plastered on every newspaper and television screen in Seattle, the tips started pouring into law enforcement.
And these weren't just random paranoid tips from the general public. These were credible tips coming from people in his own inner circle.
Wow.
Yes, the walls were closing in from inside his own house. The most significant tip came from Elizabeth Klopfer, his long-term girlfriend.
She actually called it in.
She contacted the police multiple times. She explicitly told investigators that her boyfriend matched the composite sketch, that his name was Ted, and crucially, that he drove a light brown Volkswagen Beetle.
All the pieces were there.
Furthermore, a college professor who knew him well and several of his close friends also recognized the chilling similarities and reported him to the authorities.
Put yourself in the shoes of a detective for a second. You have a composite sketch. You have a suspect named Ted. You have his own girlfriend calling you saying, "My boyfriend Ted looks like the sketch and drives the exact car you are looking for."
It seems so obvious now.
Why wasn't he arrested in August of 1974? How does he possibly walk away from that?
This is where we circle back to that massive systemic blind spot we discussed at the very beginning. The police actively dismissed him as a viable suspect because he simply did not fit their preconceived, entrenched profile of what a violent, transient serial killer should look like.
They couldn't see past the suit.
They looked at his file. He was college educated, he was involved in local Republican politics, he worked at a crisis clinic, he was articulate and polite. The societal bias of the investigators acted as a bulletproof shield, actively deflecting the investigation away from him despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence.
It is the most bitter irony of this entire story. He used his real name. He drove his own registered car. He practically handed the police his business card at Lake Sammamish. And yet, the societal assumption of what a monster looks like kept him entirely off the radar.
It saved him, at least for a while.
But he was smart enough to know that it was only a matter of time before a sharp investigator pushed past the bias and connected the dots. He needed a rock-solid alibi, and he needed a legitimate escape route.
And he found the perfect one. He had previously applied to the University of Utah School of Law and had recently been accepted.
Convenient timing.
Very. What is staggering and speaks volumes about his ability to manipulate people in power is that this law school acceptance was bolstered by official recommendation letters from a respected college professor and, incredibly, the governor of the state of Washington, Daniel J. Evans.
The ultimate camouflage.
Yeah.
You can't be a serial killer if the governor is writing your letters of recommendation.
Exactly. We call this social immunity. A letter from the governor and an acceptance to a prestigious law school provided a fortuitous and entirely legitimate, unassailable excuse to abruptly leave the state of Washington.
Just pack up and go.
On August 30th, 1974, he resigned from his job at the Department of Emergency Services in Olympia, packed his modified Volkswagen with the missing passenger seat, and began the long drive to Salt Lake City.
By moving to a new state, he was completely escaping the heat of the Ted investigation. The composite sketch hadn't been publicized in Utah. His background in Washington politics gave him a fresh, clean layer of respectability in Salt Lake City.
A clean slate.
He was hitting the reset button on his predatory cycle in a brand new, completely unsuspecting hunting ground.
And that tactical retreat effectively closed the chapter on the Washington campaign. It ended the immediate, terrifying threat in the Pacific Northwest, but tragically, it merely exported the violence to the Mountain West, where he would begin anew.
So what does this all mean for us today? As we look back at the tragic legacy of the Summer of Slaughter, the human cost is almost too heavy to quantify.
It's immense.
At least 8 women dead in Washington and Oregon, with several others strongly suspected but never found.
The physical evidence gathered at Taylor Mountain and Issaquah would eventually be the key to his downfall, but only much later. Advanced hair and fiber analysis would eventually connect the interior of his Volkswagen to those crime scenes after his final arrest.
But not soon enough to save the others.
No. In 1974, the inability of law enforcement to share data across jurisdictions, that linkage blindness, allowed him to continue his activities across 5 different states over a 4-year period.
It's the incredible, bloody cost of fragmented data. The systemic failures of the 1970s, the isolated police departments, the analog files, the lack of centralized databases, ultimately forced the complete modernization of the American criminal justice system.
A change that was desperately needed.
The digital forensic networks, the DNA databases, the behavioral profiling systems we rely on today were literally built on the ashes of these tragedies.
But beyond the systemic changes in law enforcement, we must remember the victims. Brenda Carroll Ball, Jorgen Hawkins, Janice Ann Ott, and Denise Marie Nusland.
They were vibrant young women with futures ahead of them.
And It is vital to remember that they were not targeted because they were reckless or foolish or in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right.
They were targeted specifically because of their kindness. They were targeted because they were willing to assist a stranger who appeared to be in need.
And that leaves us with a deeply unsettling realization to mull over. The terrifying truth of the 1974 campaign wasn't just that a monster was hiding in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest.
He was right there in the open.
It was that he realized he didn't need the shadows at all. He realized that the easiest way to trap someone wasn't with brute force, but by simply asking for a favor. He turned our best, most empathetic traits against us.
He really did.
And as you go about your day, as you hold the door for someone or help someone pick up a dropped item, it leaves you wondering how much of our daily social fabric still relies entirely on the basic, fragile assumption that the person asking for help is telling the truth.